was taken in the dark of night from her bed. And every hour and minute and second.
The reward poster went up on a Tuesday morning. $1 million. That number alone stopped people mid-scroll, mid-conversation, mid-breath. But it wasn't the money that made this story impossible to ignore. It was the photograph beside it. A woman with warm eyes and a familiar smile. The kind of smile that belongs to someone's mother, someone's best friend, someone's whole world. Her name was Nancy Guthrie, and she was gone. Not gone the way people sometimes disappear and show up 3 days later with an explanation. Gone in a way that left her family standing in their living room, staring at a door that wouldn't open, answering questions they didn't have answers to. Gone in a way that made investigators pause. Gone in a way that made an entire community hold its breath and check its locks at night. Her daughter stood in front of a camera, eyes red, voice barely holding together, and said 7 words that broke the internet in half. "We just want her to come home." 7 words, millions of views, and still no answers. How does someone like Nancy Guthrie, a woman deeply rooted in her community, loved by almost everyone who knew her, simply vanish? What happened in the hours before she disappeared? And why does this case carry a weight that feels different from the rest? Stay with this story, because the more you learn about Nancy Guthrie, the more you realize this isn't just a missing persons case. This is something much deeper. And the truth, whatever it is, deserves to be heard. To understand why Nancy Guthrie's disappearance shook people so deeply, you first have to understand who Nancy actually was. Not the name on the reward poster, not the face in the news thumbnail, but the real woman behind all of it. Nancy grew up in a close-knit town where everybody knew everybody. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays without being reminded. The kind who would show up at your door with food when you were grieving, without ever being asked. Neighbors described her as steady, grounded, someone who had been through hard things in her own life and come out the other side softer. Not harder. She had a laugh that people remembered. Not a polite laugh, a real one. The kind that made strangers feel like they'd known her for years. Her family said she had a gift for making people feel seen, truly seen. In a world that often moves too fast to look up, she was a mother first. That's how most people close to her would describe her. Her children were everything. Friends recalled watching her face light up the moment she talked about them, the stories she told, the pride she carried, the quiet sacrifice living underneath every decision she made. She had restructured her entire life around being present for the people she loved. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't someone who disappeared without a word. She had routines. She had commitments. She had people counting on her. And that's precisely what makes what happened so haunting. Because the Nancy Guthrie that everyone describes is not someone who walks out of her own story without a reason. In the weeks before she went missing, people who knew her say she seemed like herself, maybe a little tired, maybe carrying something quiet behind her eyes that she hadn't yet put into words. But she was making plans. She had upcoming events on her calendar. She had conversations mid-thread, promises half-kept, a life that was clearly, unmistakably in motion. And then, silence. No goodbye. No note. No phone call that made sense in hindsight. Just Nancy, and then the absence of Nancy, a chair at a table that no one wants to sit in, a phone that goes to voicemail, a door that stays closed when it used to always be open. Her family filed the report quickly. They knew, the way people who truly know someone always know, that something was wrong. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a miscommunication. Nancy would not simply disappear. Not without a fight. Not without a reason. And that certainty, the absolute, gut-level certainty of the people who loved her, is what turned a missing persons report into something. The entire country started paying attention to the morning Nancy was last seen started like most of her mornings. That's the detail that keeps circling back, the unbearable ordinariness of it. She had coffee. She made a phone call. She was, by every account, moving through her day the way she always did. There was nothing in her behavior that morning to suggest a woman preparing to vanish. People close to the investigation say the last confirmed sighting of Nancy placed her in a familiar location, somewhere she had been dozens of times before. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would have made a passerby look twice. She was simply there, and then she wasn't. What investigators began piecing together in the hours after her family raised the alarm was a timeline full of gaps. Not unusual gaps. Disappearances rarely have clean timelines, but gaps that kept deepening the more they looked. A stretch of hours unaccounted for. A route that didn't fully add up. Small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing, but together started to form a shape no one wanted to name out loud. Then her phone went dark, at a very specific point in that timeline. And that detail matters more than it might seem. Nancy was not someone who turned her phone off. Her family said she kept it on always. Out of habit, out of the same maternal instinct that meant she was always reachable, always a call away. So when her phone went dark, the people who knew her didn't read it as a dead battery. They read it as a signal. Something had changed. Something had shifted in her day. And whatever it was, it happened fast enough that Nancy didn't get to tell anyone about it. When the reward was announced, $1 million, it sent a clear, unmistakable message to the public. This family was not waiting. They were not quietly hoping. They were mobilizing every resource they had, calling in every favor, spending whatever it took to bring Nancy home. And that level of urgency told its own story. A reward of that size doesn't get offered by people who think their loved one just needed some time away. It gets offered by people who are terrified. By people who have sat in rooms with investigators and heard things that made the air leave their lungs. By people who understand, with the sharp, terrible clarity that grief sometimes delivers, that time is not on their side. The public responded immediately. Tips flooded in. People who had seen someone matching Nancy's description came forward. People who had information they weren't sure was relevant suddenly felt the weight of that uncertainty and picked up the phone. Social media lit up. Volunteers mobilized. Complete strangers printed flyers and drove to areas investigators had mentioned, the kind of collective response that only happens when a community feels something true and urgent in its bones. But for all the noise, for all the movement and momentum, Nancy had still not been found. Every lead was followed. Every tip was processed. And investigators kept circling back to the same unanswered questions. The same silences in the timeline. The same feeling that the answer was close, dangerously close, and still just out of reach. As days turned into weeks, the people closest to Nancy began doing something that families in these situations always do. They started looking backward, combing through memories, replaying conversations, searching for the moment they might have missed, the sentence that might have meant something different than they thought. And in that searching, some things came to light. Not accusations, not evidence of wrongdoing, just the quiet, complicated texture of a real human life. Nancy, like most people, had chapters she didn't broadcast. She had gone through difficult periods. She had navigated relationships that hadn't always been easy. She had made hard choices, the kind that leave marks even when you make the right call. People who had known her for years described a woman who had fought hard for the version of her life she'd built. She hadn't been handed stability. She had chosen it deliberately after periods of real turbulence. That context matters, not because it explains what happened to her, but because it deepens the understanding of who she truly was. She was a survivor, long before anyone started using that word about her disappearance. Those who knew her well spoke about a quiet strength she carried. She didn't talk about her past openly. She processed things internally, held things close. But every now and then, in unguarded moments, she would say something that revealed just how deeply she understood resilience, the cost of starting over, the courage it takes to choose yourself even when it's terrifying. The woman who disappeared was not fragile. That's the point her family kept returning to again and again. She was not someone easily overwhelmed, which made her silence even louder. Hidden inside every disappearance case is a question that investigators always ask, but rarely say out loud in public. Who was the last person who truly understood what was happening in this person's life? Not the version they showed at family dinners. The real version, the one that existed in private moments, in text messages never meant to be read by strangers, in conversations held behind closed doors. For Nancy's family, that question opened up a painful process, not because they found anything dark or damning, but because they realized, with the particular ache that grief delivers, that even the people who love someone most don't always know everything. There are rooms inside every person that stay locked, not out of deception, but out of protection. Protection for themselves, protection for the people they love. Investigators followed threads leading into Nancy's recent months with careful, methodical attention. They looked at her communications, her patterns, the people she had been in contact with, and while much of that investigation remains confidential, the kind of operational secrecy that active cases require, what seeped out through official statements and family comments was this: nothing they found diminished Nancy. Nothing pointed to a woman who had invited danger into her life carelessly. What it pointed to was a woman navigating something that perhaps only she understood the full shape of, and that something, whatever it was, intersected fatally, or perhaps not fatally, hope being what it is, with the very moment she disappeared. The investigation expanded in scope in ways the public could feel, even without access to the details. Additional agencies were brought in. Resources were allocated at a level that signaled, without stating it directly, that this was no longer a local matter. Search areas widened. Digital forensics teams worked through data trails. Specialists in cases of this nature flew in, reviewed what had been gathered, and began asking their own pointed questions. Nancy's family remained present throughout, not on the periphery, present in the rooms, present in the conversations, doing everything asked of them and more. Her daughter became the face of the public appeal, stepping in front of cameras with a composure that visibly cost her something every single time. She answered questions carefully. She kept the focus exactly where it needed to be, finding Nancy, bringing her home. The community around that family did something remarkable. It held. Usually, as time stretches in a missing persons case, attention drifts. The news cycle moves on. People feel helpless, and that helplessness quietly converts into distance. But in this case, something different happened. The vigils kept drawing people. The online searches kept climbing. Strangers kept showing up. Part of that sustained attention came from the reward and the media coverage. But part of it, a significant part, came from something harder to explain. Something about Nancy's story, about the humanity of her, about the image of her family standing in impossible circumstances with their arms wide open, made people feel personally implicated in her outcome, as if her return, or the lack of it, said something about all of us. There are moments in a case like this when the investigation pivots, when something shifts, quietly or dramatically, and the work changes direction entirely. Those following closely began noticing subtle signals that the investigation had found new footing. Official statements became slightly more specific. Language shifted in small but meaningful ways, from "we are actively searching" to phrasing that implied a more defined focus, a sharper and more deliberate line of inquiry. Whether that shift came from a new tip, a piece of forensic evidence, or something that emerged from the digital investigation, no one was saying publicly. But the energy around the case had changed. Investigators, who had been running parallel tracks, seemed to converge. Meetings happened that the family described as significant, without elaborating further. Meanwhile, Nancy's story continued spreading. It crossed state lines. It reached international audiences. People who had never heard of this community before found themselves reading every update, sharing every post, donating to search efforts, translating information into other languages so more people could help. The $1 million reward had turned a local tragedy into a global conversation. And inside that conversation, something quietly extraordinary was happening. People who had experienced similar losses began reaching out to Nancy's family, not with tips, but with solidarity, with the particular comfort that only comes from someone who has stood in the same unbearable place. A network was forming around this case, around this family, that no reward money could have manufactured. It was built entirely from human feeling. The toll on Nancy's family was visible to anyone paying close attention. You could see it in the subtle hollowing around the eyes of those who spoke publicly. You could hear it in the pauses before sentences, those half-second gaps, where the full weight of what was unsaid lived quietly. They were holding themselves together with a determination that was in itself, a form of love. Performing normalcy for each other, keeping structure alive in a life that had lost its center. Her children leaned on each other in ways they described as both heartbreaking and unexpectedly beautiful. Crisis has a way of stripping pretense. Disagreements that once felt significant became irrelevant overnight. Distances, emotional and geographic, collapsed without warning. Siblings who had drifted in the normal busyness of adult life found themselves sharing a kitchen, sharing silence, sharing the specific exhaustion that comes from hope maintained under enormous, unrelenting pressure. Friends of the family described checking in daily, bringing food that sometimes went uneaten, sitting in living rooms without speaking, because sometimes presence is the only thing left to offer. The community around Nancy's family was sustaining itself, the way communities have always sustained themselves through loss, imperfectly, tenderly, one quiet day at a time. What kept everyone going, what they returned to in the darkest hours, was the image of Nancy herself, her laugh, her steadiness, the specific and irreplaceable way she made people feel. Grief is always proof of love, but this felt like something more. This felt like a refusal, a collective refusal to accept that someone like Nancy could simply be erased from the world. Without a reckoning. In the midst of the pain, there were also small, unexpected moments of light. People came forward with stories about Nancy that her own family hadn't known. A woman in another town described how Nancy had helped her during a terrible period years ago. A kindness never mentioned, never held over anyone, simply given and left behind like a quiet gift. A man described a single conversation with Nancy that had changed the way he thought about something deeply important. These stories kept arriving, unsolicited, from people who had carried them privately and felt now, finally, was the time to release them into the world. They painted a portrait of someone whose impact was larger than she probably ever knew. That's one of the quiet tragedies nested inside this story. The possibility that Nancy moved through the world without fully understanding how many lives she had touched, how many people she had steadied simply by being who she was, how her presence, which she probably experienced as ordinary, was anything but ordinary to the people around her. The family absorbed these stories with a gratitude that was also grief. Every new story was both a treasure and a reminder of absence. It confirmed what they already knew, that finding Nancy wasn't just about one family's healing. It was about returning something to the world that the world genuinely needed. Investigators continued their work. The family continued their vigil. And somewhere, in whatever silence or circumstance held Nancy, the hope remained, stubborn, irrational, necessary, that the story was not finished, that the door would open, that she would come home. Cases like Nancy Guthrie's remind us of something we can easily forget in the noise of ordinary life, that people are irreplaceable, not in an abstract way, in a specific, felt, daily way, in the empty chair, in the phone call that doesn't come, in the absence that quietly reshapes every room it touches. If you know anything at all, that might help bring Nancy home, the family is asking you to come forward. The reward remains active, the investigation remains open, and the family remains, every single day, doing the hardest thing a person can do, holding on to hope without a guarantee. Share this story, not just for the algorithm, but because someone somewhere might see it and remember something they didn't know they needed to remember, because information finds its way to the right place when enough people carry it forward together. And if you're watching this simply because you care, that matters too. The attention of a compassionate public is not a small thing. It keeps cases alive. It keeps families from feeling invisible in their worst moments. It says, in a language that needs no translation, "We see you, we haven't forgotten, and we're not going anywhere." Nancy's family hasn't given up. Neither should we.